Voilà. Tu m'entends? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Gilles, est-ce que tu m'entends?
Je t'entends bien.
Ok. Alors bouge pas maintenant, je vais aller sur le canal anglais. Bouge pas. À tout de suite. Voilà, je suis sur le canal anglais. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Est-ce que tu m'entends, Gilles?
Ok, Patrick, thanks.
Ouais, c'est super. Thank you. Bye bye. Bonne fin de journée. Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. We'll just ask everyone to take their seats, and we can start again. We can resume. Just give a second. Very good. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll just get straight back to business after lunch, and we're going to continue on the speakers list, starting with Civic and then going to Israel. So, Civic, you have the floor now.
Is it working? Perfect. On behalf of Civic, we commend Ireland's tirelessness leadership on this political declaration process. Civic welcomes the final draft, which clearly recognizes the harm caused to civilians and civilian infrastructure when explosive weapons are used in towns and cities, and identifies a roadmap for action to strengthen protection norms. This declaration is a practical tool that sets an agenda for change to military policy and practices. It recognizes that survivors and family members of those injured and killed should be assisted to rebuild their lives, and that much work is needed to address the long-term impacts resulting from the destruction of infrastructure. Civic calls on states to support the political declaration and turn the commitments laid out in the document into actions. As an organization that works in conflict zone and directly engages with militaries to improve civilian harm mitigation practices and policies, we're aware of the challenges ahead. But we also know that only through collective action and political will, we can set stronger standards for the protection of civilians. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to Israel, to be followed by Turkey.
Thank you, Ambassador. Israel would like to take this opportunity to thank you and your team, both here and in Dublin, for all your efforts in leading this process. Israel believes that the issue of protection of civilians in urban warfare is of great significance and already takes policy measures above and beyond the law of armed conflict, and will continue to do so in order to promote this protection. It was important for us to take an active and constructive role in the consultations over the past few years. We would like to thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important issue. Mr. Chairperson, we are still reviewing the updated text as part of an internal interagency process. At this point, we would like to offer some general comments on the current draft of the political declaration and remarks on a few specific paragraphs. First, it is important to note that as this is a political declaration, it does not create any new legal obligations, nor is it intended to change, interpret, or otherwise implicate existing legal obligations, including customary international law. In this regard, we note that in several instances, the declaration does not use the accepted legal terms, for example, by using the non-legal terms civilian harm, critical infrastructure, reverberating effects, and others. The use of these terms in the declaration and the declaration as a whole have no bearing on international law. In this regard, the declaration should not be read as changing legal views previously expressed by states, and specifically does not implicate in any way Israel's legal obligations or positions. Secondly, although this declaration focuses on the use of explosive weapons, we believe that the humanitarian implications of urban warfare and their root causes span across a wide range of factors, rather than just the use of certain types of weapons. As Israel reiterated throughout the process, the declaration's scope should have been broader in order to more effectively serve the underlying goal of protection of civilians in urban warfare. Most notably, the declaration should have addressed much more prominently the common root cause of urban warfare, which is the reality of non-state armed groups who often deliberately conduct their operations from within populated areas, while making use of human shields and other tactics designed to intentionally exploit the proximity of civilians and civilian objects to military objectives. Without this deliberate strategy applied by those groups, the worldwide scale of urban warfare would decrease dramatically. It is unfortunate that the declaration insufficiently addresses this issue without taking a more practical approach. In any event, it is important to read this declaration as referring only to a specific aspect in the protection of civilians during urban warfare, and not as an exhaustive document on this crucial issue. Mr. Chair, I will move on to our remarks on specific paragraphs. Regarding paragraph 2.1, the issue of the applicability of international human rights law during armed conflict is a controversial matter which attracts divergent views. Due to the reference of international human rights law in the text, we reiterate Israel's position in this regard, that the law of armed conflict and international human rights law, which are codified in separate instruments, remain distinct and apply in different circumstances. Regarding 2.5, we welcome the addition of this paragraph and believe that recognizing the lawfulness in principle of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas or otherwise is important in recalling the basic legal situation which underlines the whole declaration. Still, such weapons must be used in accordance with the law of armed conflict. It is in this light that relevant provisions in the declaration, including paragraph 3.3, need to be read. Regarding paragraph 2.6, this is a new paragraph which was added to the last draft of the declaration without being previously discussed during the consultation process. This is an important paragraph as it clearly stipulates the prohibition on conducting attacks that make civilians or civilian objects the object of attack. However, in the last part of the paragraph, we think it would benefit to clarify that the references to indiscriminate shelling or use of explosive weapons relate to indiscriminate attacks, which is the common and more accurate term in this regard. As we see it as a technical legal correction, we suggest adding the word by after the words as well as. And in any case, we read this provision in the context of conducting attacks. Regarding paragraph 3.3, we think the text has generally improved in comparison to its previous version. However, we have a few remarks. First, as indicated by the words as appropriate, by the use of non-legal terms and by additional indications, the current wording should be understood as a policy undertaking, which does not reflect a legal obligation under the law of armed conflict. This understanding is also consistent with the general remarks I provided at the outset regarding the overall political nature of the declaration. Second, Israel reads the words as appropriate in paragraph 3.3 as referring to both alternatives of restricting and refraining from the use of explosive weapons. In other words, endorsing states have discretion on whether to impose any policy limitation on top of their LOAC obligations regarding the use of a WIPA, and as such, they may choose between imposing policy restrictions on the use of a WIPA, refraining from using it, or neither, as appropriate when the use may be expected to cause harm to civilians. Third, this undertaking should be taken in light of military considerations and the alternatives to the use of a WIPA, including alternative means that are reasonably available and achieve the same military advantages. In this regard, we recognize that the use of explosive weapons may be the only lawful available means to accomplish the military mission. Regarding paragraph 4.5, different states have different obligations under international law regarding assistance to victims affected by armed conflict, and this issue is also subject to specific regulation in national laws and policies that diverge between states. Therefore, this paragraph should be read while recognizing that the assistance or support to victims may vary in accordance to the different national laws and policies of the state in question. Regarding paragraph 4.7, we believe that the recent changes in the wording of the paragraph improved it to some extent, most notably by focusing on exchange of good practices and policies among states, which we believe has a great value, as well as the addition of the phrase a collaborative spirit. We believe that any such potential discussions must adhere to the imperatives of being state-driven, professional, non-political, and non-contextualized, that states would address only their own practices and policies, and also that they will not be intended to develop new law. We believe these principles reflect the purpose of such discussions and are essential for their success to allow for productive and constructive work to be done. As we previously mentioned, we are still reviewing the text, and these remarks are not exhaustive. And Chair, I would like to once again thank you and your team for all your work, dedication, and efforts on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I proceed, I should remind delegations that if you have a text, it would really help the interpreters if you could send that text to speeches@un.org. Thank you very much. So, next speaker on the list is Turkey, to be followed by Costa Rica.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We appreciate your outstanding efforts carried out during the preparation process of the political declaration. We would like to underline that Turkey supports all efforts to maintain international security through arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament, and continues to favor global and complete disarmament. Turkey is a party to the relevant international agreements and meticulously fulfills its obligations arising from them. Turkey supports the efforts to address humanitarian impact of the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in populated areas in order to reduce harm to civilians and prevent civilians from its indirect effects. The government of Turkey has provided assurances that every effort is being made to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. All operations have been conducted in full respect for international law, especially international humanitarian law. Only targeting terrorists and terrorist hideouts, weapons and vehicles by delicately applying principles and requirements of distinction, proportionality, military necessity, and measures. Considering that the terrorist organization PKK-YPG uses civilians as human shields, all necessary measures have been taken to prevent any harm to civilians. Mr. Ambassador, we have actively been engaged in the preparation process of the declaration from the beginning, shared our opinions constructively, and delivered our proposals. We support the goal strived to achieve with the political declaration. Mr. Ambassador, I would like to highlight our opinions about the political declaration. At first, this political declaration shall not be interpreted as creating additional legal rights and obligations under international humanitarian law. And we have said repeatedly, the term so-called non-state armed groups is an ambiguous and could be misinterpreted or misused. It doesn't make any differentiation between other actors and terrorist organizations. Therefore, we are strongly against any engagement with terrorist groups by misusing and exploiting the very nature of this term. Terrorist organizations, whose primary aim is to inflict violence on civilian targets, have no limits to intensify their acts, no rules to abide by, and no respect for human life. Strike fear into civilians in the forms of suicide bombings, car bombs, and roadside explosives in the populated areas. Within this context, the political declaration should not pave the way for terrorist groups to use populated areas as safe havens for their heinous acts. Mr. Ambassador, similar to the amended Article 1, paragraph 4 and 5 of the Certain Conventional Weapons Convention, this declaration should not be invoked for the purpose of affecting the sovereignty of a state and used as justification for intervening directly or indirectly. As we highlighted before, UN and UN agencies should gather the information to evaluate the impacts caused by military operations. If it is not the case, NGOs that will gather and report information should be impartial, and all states must acknowledge their trustworthiness and reliability. In their reports, NGOs must also attribute each terrorist organization indiscriminately, which is responsible for civilian casualties from their use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Right now, this is not the case. Daesh is not the only terrorist group in the world. Today, where terrorist organizations increasingly refer to disinformation, confirming all information with other reliable sources has become essential. We should not allow terrorist organizations to use the process for their malicious motives. Political declaration aims to provide states to use explosive weapons in a responsible way. Why don't we add wording to the declaration that imposes a responsibility on NGOs to use unselective, unbiased, and validated information and be careful about their origin of sources? We would like to see an addition to the declaration in that direction. In the text, stakeholders contain ambiguity for us. In our view, stakeholders should have been specified in order to clarify their relevance. Mr. Ambassador, we are supportive of the military-to-military exchange and compilation of good policies and practices, and exchange of views on emerging concepts and terminology. I thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to Costa Rica, to be followed by Article 36. Costa Rica, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. As it's the first time that Costa Rica is taking the floor at this meeting, we would like to express the recognition of our country to the work and leadership shown by your team to achieve this declaration. We welcome and applaud the efforts of Ireland including the transparent and inclusive method for the negotiations. For our country, this draft declaration, whilst not fully perfect, shows the delicate balance that we can achieve. It shows the commitment of states to ensure that civilians are protected and civilian objects too, such as ensuring that there's evacuation available, and it shows an energetic rejection by the international community to attacks against civilians and other protected people, and the strong rejection of the international community to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. These are commitments that are particularly relevant given the international context in which the negotiations are currently taking place. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas has consequences in the short, medium, and long term, and it's time to recognize this reality. My country is fully committed to international humanitarian law and the international law for human rights, and that's why we protect its principles and the civilian populations who suffer the harmful effects of war. Chair, Costa Rica would like to repeat its gratitude for this political declarations draft and for the work on sorting the last details of the instrument. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Article 36, to be followed by Australia.
Thank you, Ambassador Gaffey. Let me begin by expressing our warm appreciation to Ireland and to you, Ambassador, and your team for leading this process in at times very challenging circumstances and for bringing this phase to a successful conclusion today. We also warmly thank the states that came before you, in particular Austria, and all those that have contributed constructively to the discussions over the years. It's been more than a decade since we, civil society, the United Nations, and the International Committee of the Red Cross began drawing attention to the devastating humanitarian and broader consequences of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Back then, our concern was motivated by what we were seeing in Afghanistan, Iraq, the occupied Palestinian territory, Sri Lanka, and Somalia. Today, some of the contexts have changed, but we still see the same consequences, the same pattern of harm to civilians in Ukraine, but also in Ethiopia, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere. And that pattern will continue or will worsen unless we collectively work against it. Recognizing and acknowledging that there is a problem to be addressed is the fundamental starting point for tackling that problem. The states that join this declaration, and we're encouraged to hear that many in this room intend to do so, will be recognizing that the use of explosive weapons in populated areas is associated with a consistent pattern of harm to civilians, a pattern of deaths and injuries, of psychological scars, of population displacement, and of long-term damage to the fabric of social and economic life. This pattern goes beyond the individual case-by-case interpretations of international humanitarian law by parties to conflict, and it goes beyond what might be directly foreseeable from individual choices. But over time, this pattern represents the greater part of suffering experienced by people in conflict. This declaration commits states to work to address these harms, to better understand the effects of explosive weapons, to review and develop policies and practices that impose stronger limits on the use of weapons, to assist victims, and to work together collaboratively and with the wider community of stakeholders to strengthen the protection of civilians. Article 36 looks forward to continuing to build an evidence-based conversation across different technical communities on how to prevent and reduce harm from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And we look forward to working with all states that join this declaration to build a community of practice in a collaborative spirit. Of course, a collaborative spirit should also mean that we can engage in frank conversations. We will continue to push states to recognize that the use of wide-area explosive weapons, where the weapon's effects cannot be contained to a specific military objective, should be avoided in populated areas. Similarly, we look forward to operational conversations about the tracking of civilian harm during military operations, and on how work to assist victims can be better implemented and supported, amongst other subjects. And we will need to set and maintain an expectation that joining this declaration will be followed up with action and with change. The declaration, after all, provides space for states to come to stronger national positions over time. Continued, open, and consistent communication between all parties will provide a solid foundation for the effective implementation of the declaration, and also to the process of bringing more states on board over time. We know that not all states will join this declaration, and we should not have any anxiety about that. So the pattern of harm from explosive weapons will continue or worsen unless we collectively work against it. 45 years ago this month saw the adoption of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which pushed back against the carpet bombing of towns and cities. Our social understanding of what is acceptable in conflict is shaped by our reactions to the harms we are presented with and by our choices. Joining this declaration should communicate a choice to keep pushing back against the acceptability of widespread bombing and bombardment in urban areas. We have no illusions that this declaration will solve that problem, but it can help to build a collaborative conversation that keeps us pushing as best we can towards stronger protection of civilians. In this regard, Ambassador Gaffey, your work has also established a tone of communication and a sense of cooperation and engagement that will serve us all and the declaration well in the next phase. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Give the floor next.
Je vous remercie. Je donne la parole à l'Australie. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Chair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais vous remercier ainsi que votre délégation pour le travail que vous avez investi dans la préparation de ce projet de texte. Nous reconnaissons le besoin de trouver un équilibre entre le besoin de toutes les délégations dans la pièce. Nous avons participé à ces négociations au cours des années passées. Je vous remercie d'avoir pris en compte notre avis. L'Australie réitère son soutien au besoin de protéger les conflits dans le cadre des conflits armés. Ces questions sont importantes et cette importance est soulignée par l'agression russe en Ukraine. Nous condamnons l'agression unilatérale et illégale de la Russie en Ukraine, y compris les bombardements à l'égard des zones peuplées. Ma délégation a évalué ce projet de texte final de manière précise. À notre sens, il s'agit d'une version largement améliorée du texte. Nous vous remercions d'avoir cherché à trouver un point d'équilibre entre nos différentes opinions. En ce qui concerne la déclaration dans son ensemble, nous nous réjouissons que cette version actuelle promeuve la conformité avec le DHI en temps de conflit armé. Cette déclaration suggère également des mesures qui permettent de renforcer la protection des civils. Il s'agit là d'un élément crucial. Nous l'avons entendu dans le cadre des négociations. Le problème n'est pas un manque de législation, mais le non-respect de ces lois. Afin de réduire la souffrance des populations civiles en cas de conflit armé, il faut garantir le respect du droit international en la matière. L'Australie se félicite des amendements qui ont été apportés au texte, permettant d'amender ou de retirer les mentions du texte du mot réverbération. Cela nous semble mieux refléter le consensus concernant la définition de ce terme qui reste ambigu. Au paragraphe 2.1, nous avons un commentaire. On y fait référence aux obligations de reddition de comptes pour les auteurs de violations du DHI et du droit international des droits humains. Ma délégation a par le passé exprimé le fait que de notre point de vue, cette formulation est trop vague et manque de précision. Elle pourrait être interprétée de manière erronée.
Regardless of who committed the violation, the nature of the violation.
La nature de la violation, le lieu où elle a eu lieu et l'auteur doivent être pris en compte. Sous sa forme actuelle, on a l'impression que ce paragraphe fait référence aux dispositions qui s'appliquent dans un contexte spécifique. Ne propose pas d'amendement de nouvelle interprétation du droit applicable aujourd'hui. Au 3.3, vous avez réussi à répondre aux interrogations de ma délégation et d'autres délégations par rapport au projet du texte précédent. Le paragraphe 3.3, comme vous nous l'avez dit, ne suggère pas une mesure d'interdiction totale d'emploi des armes explosives dans les zones peuplées. Elle ne propose pas non plus une nouvelle interprétation du DHI. Ce paragraphe 3 présente les options, une liste non exhaustive d'options qui permettent d'éviter de causer des dommages aux populations civiles. Dans certains cas, la nécessité militaire, des questions militaires peut imposer le recours aux armes explosives, mais cela doit se faire dans le respect du DHI, y compris des principes de précaution, de proportionnalité.
Chair, we finish by reiterating our strong condemnation.
Monsieur le Président, nous souhaiterions condamner encore une fois l'utilisation illégale des armes explosives dans les zones peuplées. Nous espérons qu'ensemble, nos travaux pourront garantir de véritables modifications et une vraie protection des populations civiles. Nous continuerons d'évaluer ce texte à la lumière des opinions qui ont été exprimées aujourd'hui. Nous vous remercions pour votre direction dans nos travaux. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor next to Wilf, and that
Je
to be
donne la
followed
parole
by
à
Bulgaria.
Wilf, puis à la Bulgarie.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Mission of Ireland for taking the initiative on this declaration.
D'Irlande d'avoir pris l'initiative de cette déclaration. Je leur remercie d'avoir invité la société civile à participer à ce processus. Nous vous saluons pour les efforts qui ont été consentis afin de garantir des consultations ouvertes. Nous saluons également les contributions constructives proposées par les organisations internationales, la société civile et les États partis, y compris les communautés affectées, ce qui a permis de constituer ce projet de déclaration politique. Depuis plus d'une décennie, nous avons travaillé main dans la main afin de lutter contre les dégâts et les décès causés par les bombardements de villes et de villages. Les pertes civiles qui en découlent ont été bien documentées par la société civile et les agences humanitaires. Au cours de ces négociations, un grand nombre d'acteurs ont souligné le fait que lorsque des armes explosives sont utilisées dans des zones peuplées, 90% des victimes sont des civils. Les données dont nous disposons nous montrent que l'utilisation de ces armes a des effets physiques, sociaux, mentaux et économiques à long terme. Cela fait des années que nous exprimons ce point de vue. Nous aurions aimé l'adoption d'un instrument. Nous réjouissons de l'adoption d'un instrument fort. Nous reconnaissons les efforts qui sont entrés en ligne pour la rédaction de la déclaration. Les mesures d'assistance humanitaire auront des effets directs sur les personnes qui sont touchées par l'utilisation de telles armes. Cela contribuera aux efforts sur place pour lutter contre les effets à long terme dont souffrent les communautés. Nous saluons la reconnaissance du biais de genre existant dans ce domaine et demandons plus de recherche dans ce domaine. Nous encourageons les États à également prendre en compte les effets sur les populations basés sur le handicap et d'autres facteurs. Cela doit être pris en compte dans la fourniture d'un secours. Au-delà des effets positifs de la déclaration, nous considérons que les États auraient pu et devraient être plus ambitieux dans leurs objectifs. Et dans ce contexte, nous regrettons
adding the expression as appropriate after the commitment to restrain or refrain from using explosive weapons in populated areas. There is a possibility that this paragraph could be interpreted as contradicting one of the critical and stated goals of the declaration, which is to provide clearly parameters for implementing international humanitarian law.
Okay. I could hear it. Let me just see if this works.
Should I continue?
Is there
Okay.
a problem on this bank?
No?
Just
Let's try again. Say,
Hi, can I continue? Can you hear me?
no, it keeps coming back.
it's fine.
Is it working? It's working out? Okay, cool. Thank you. Oh, no, thank you, thank you. The intention in 3.3 is eminently clear as a matter of construction. Positioning as appropriate after reference to the commitments to restrain or refrain from the use of a WIPA indicates that states should decide which is appropriate in specific circumstances, that is, whether they restrain, use, or refrain from it altogether. In either case, the commitment itself is not subject to the qualification. To read it otherwise is to render the intention void. The goal of the political declaration is to promote a presumption against the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and that is the manner in which this paragraph must be applied. The same understanding must be applied to paragraph 4.2. The reference to where feasible and appropriate in terms of data sharing is problematic because data should always be shared in order to help prevent civilian harm. This is relevant not only because it can inform understandings on the impacts of the use of a WIPA and the responses, but also to make arms transfers assessment as mandated by the Arms Trade Treaty and other relevant instruments. Given the powerful interventions by states and civil society throughout the consultation process in favor of strong commitments that will make a meaningful difference in civilian lives, it is clear that this declaration is categorically opposed to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and must be interpreted and implemented as such. International humanitarian law and international human rights law are clear that the practice of bombing towns, cities, and villages is unacceptable and must end. And read as a whole, the declaration stands as an important contribution to end this horrific practice. The commitments taken in this declaration must have a direct impact on the lives of those living in conflict. Bombing is going on all around us. People are dying, living in fear, being separated from their families, struggling to survive conflict and its aftermath. The decision to use explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas is a political, military, and economic choice made by governments. This declaration must facilitate the choice to save lives. We'll defend interpretation and implementation of this declaration as an instrument that sets a strong normative framing against the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We see this declaration as a recognition from states that the power to avoid civilian harm lies in their hands, and that the best way to do that is to end the use of these weapons in populated areas. Civilians can no longer be the ones who bear the burden of suffering from actions caused by states that are pursuing political and economic agendas. This declaration makes it clear that the protection of civilians' lives must be prioritized, and we will hold states accountable to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to Bulgaria, to be followed by Ecuador.
And the Bulgarian delegation, is it working? Okay, I'm sorry. Mr. Chairman, the Bulgarian delegation would like to commend Ireland for the highly professional, transparent and inclusive way in which you made us all embark on a road of a very sensitive and very important process. We consider the final draft as it stands now in front of us being a very good compromise, allowing us all to conduct military operations and policies by applying the highest possible standards when implementing IHL in practical terms. Yet some questions remain still without an answer. Among them is how we bring in practical terms all parties to an armed conflict into the pattern of implementation of and complying with IHL norms and commitments, and by that we mean, Mr. Chairman, non-states parties as well as states parties. The military invasion of the Russian Federation in Ukraine is yet another proof that our efforts in strengthening the IHL is timely and very much needed. The main challenge ahead of us is further developing, agreeing and implementing the practical measures allowing us all to follow our commitments and prove that we are capable to practice what we preach and provide for a real-world humanitarian impact, as very rightly pointed out by our US colleague. Last but not least, Mr. Chairman, and on a more joyful note, I recall a promise by a member of your delegation to book a castle somewhere in Ireland for the signing ceremony of the EWIPA declaration. I would like to not miss this opportunity to wish you for the success you had so far, to be with you also while accomplishing this very last step of your humanitarian initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Luckily, we have a few castles in Ireland, so I'll say no more. We give the floor next to Ecuador, followed by Republic of Korea.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, I'd like to join the other delegations who've spoken before me to express our sincere gratitude for your leadership and for the efforts made throughout the negotiation process for the political declaration. Without doubt, inclusivity and transparency that has been shown has been an essential element in achieving the support that you have received for the proposed text. As we have said before, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas is a major concern in the humanitarian area because of the harm to civilians and their environment. And my country has raised its voice on the need to act to protect populations and to avoid the effects of indiscriminate harm caused by these weapons. We hoped for a more ambitious declaration which would commit states to avoid or abstain from using these type of arms in populated zones, in particular those with high reach. And so we consider that the text doesn't yet cover our full expectations, but we also understand that the text is the product of a long negotiation process which has involved compromises from all delegations involved. So there are some very important elements, including it recognizes the risks that is involved in the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and the consequent need to strengthen the protection of civilians and civilian objects from the consequences of their use. And there is clear reference to the direct and indirect effects on civilians. It gathers the importance of collecting data on these events, and it also includes commitments which go beyond the repetition of saying that we have to meet international humanitarian law, but it also mentions the need to evaluate national policies and practices to ensure that we protect when explosive weapons are used in populated areas in order to avoid damage to civilians. And whilst it doesn't have a categoric message on the need to abstain from using these weapons in populated areas as we would have liked, it does have a commitment to implement policy and practices and the restriction and avoidance of their use whenever it goes beyond military objectives. But it carries out an assessment and follow-up for the achievement of the goals, and it helps us to increase the commitment in the future if we haven't yet fully managed to strengthen the protection of civilians. Thinking of the text, and we follow your suggestion to not bring about changes, we would like to highlight some elements we consider particularly important. On the one hand, we welcome the inclusion in paragraph 1.2 of the additional risks from the use when they have certain characteristics that make them wide-ranging. And we understand that in paragraph 3.1, it mentions the implementation of national policy and practice to protect civilians during armed conflict involving explosive weapons. We think that it doesn't yet have the commitment that each member signatory should have when it comes to ensure that it's sufficiently clear to meet their commitment. When we talk about paragraph 3.3, the central point of this declaration, whilst in our opinion it doesn't have language which is sufficiently ambitious, and we would have preferred the earlier version, we read it as a whole, and we see it as a significant step. So states will commit to avoid or restrict or refrain from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas so that we can come to a final ending of this use. So we can support the text proposed for the declaration. And finally, as others have indicated, this political declaration is just the beginning of the process, and the implementation of the commitments and their follow-up will allow an evaluation of the real impact of our decisions on the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And so we will continue to support the process in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to the Republic of Korea, to be followed by Italy.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Mr. Ambassador. First of all, I'd like to appreciate the government of Ireland the leading discussions over the past 3 years in inclusive and open and transparent manner. My delegation thinks that we've reached upon a well-balanced final draft for the political declaration. My government supports the current versions of the declaration. Thank you once again for you and your team. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Italy, to be followed by Norwegian People's Aid. Italy, you have the floor.
Mr. Ambassador, at the outset, let me congratulate you and the whole Irish team for the excellent work you have conducted since the beginning of this very important process that aims at adopting a political declaration which addresses humanitarian harm arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Italy has always appreciated the opportunity to be active part to these consultations, sharing the deep concern of the international community for the devastating effects produced by the use of these weapons on civilians and civilian objects. Entire communities face deadly injuries and long-lasting disabilities, psychological traumas, economic and social disruption, while urban areas are deprived of crucial infrastructures providing energy, water, healthcare, and education. Families with women, children, and elderly people, the most vulnerable, are forced to migrate, abandoning their roots and heritage, putting their lives at tremendous risks, including the one of death. We highly appreciate the inclusive and constructive way the Presidency conducted its consultations with all relevant stakeholders and the efforts spearheaded in progressing towards a text that carefully balances security needs and humanitarian imperatives. Protecting civilians shall be our primary goal in all military operations, and this political declaration strengthens this collective commitment. Compliance with commitments and obligations of international humanitarian law must be assured in all circumstances and by all parties in conflict. And we appreciate the political declaration stressing such importance. We welcome in particular the reference to the prohibition against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and the obligation to hold accountable those responsible for violations, committing to end impunity. The challenging dynamics of current conflicts require adapting policies, doctrines, and military tactics to the conduct of military operations in populated areas to help avoid and in any event to minimize civilian harm. We welcome the political declaration referring to the comprehensive training of the armed forces on the application of international humanitarian law and the relevant policies and good practices in the conduct of hostilities. This process can benefit from the experience of those states that have relevant experience in military operations and that have shown to act responsibly and always in compliance with international humanitarian law. Ensuring the clearance and removal of explosive remnants of war after the end of hostilities and supporting risk education policies recalled by the declaration is a provision to which Italy attaches great importance, also being a principle integrated in our mine action strategy. We also commend your reference to facilitating and supporting assistance to victims with a holistic, gender-sensitive, and no-discriminatory approach, duly considering the rights of persons with disabilities and post-conflict recovery. The attention for gender, diversity, inclusion, along with support to sustainable development, is an integral part of Italy's humanitarian approaches and strategies. Finally, let me conclude by saying that we deeply value the involvement of all relevant stakeholders in this process, including the United Nations and other relevant organizations operating in the field, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross. The contribution of academia and civil society is equally important, and we count on all relevant actors in actively promoting this declaration and pursuing its adoption. Please be assured, Ambassador, of Italy's full support in this endeavor. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor next to Norwegian People's Aid, followed by Uruguay. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. As this is the first time my delegation is taking the floor, please allow me to thank you and Ireland for the dedicated work and invested efforts in bringing this process to where it is today, and MPA extends our gratitude and congratulations. It is a fact, which we have also heard underlined today, that the use of explosive weapons in populated areas is the leading cause of harm to civilians in armed conflicts. The explosive weapons in populated areas political declaration process has succeeded in establishing the norm that the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in urban and populated settings causes grave, direct and reverberating harm to civilian population, and as such cannot be tolerated and has to be addressed. Civilians must be protected at all times by all actors and under all circumstances. As an international disarmament and mine action operator, NPA has decades of experience responding to the needs caused by the immediate and long-term effects of explosive weapons, which proved time and again to be particularly devastating in urban and populated areas. Their harm is not only immediate and indiscriminate, but also lingers long after a conflict is over, protracting crisis, imposing great risk to civilian lives and livelihoods, hindering humanitarian access, return of displaced populations, reconstruction and development efforts for decades after their intended use has expired. It also deepens already existing social disadvantages, thus further marginalizing and harming certain groups of civilians for years to come. We welcome the wide statements of support of the political declaration text expressed here today by many states, and hope this indicates strong commitment further down the line when it comes to the signing and implementation stages. For the full success and to reinforce the norm laid out by this process, we must demonstrate concerted efforts and urge states to not only sign but also fully implement the provisions laid out in the WIPO political declaration text, and also as soon as possible. It is only by turning the words we commit to into concrete measures and actions that we will achieve true protection of civilians. Framework laid out in the political declaration should soon translate into corresponding national strategies, national standards, and good practices to ensure harm to civilians in conflict is minimized. We hope states continue to recognize the imperative need for this declaration in present times, which are bringing increasingly urban conflicts where it is nearly impossible to ensure no civilian harm. The density and pure nature of populated areas implies there could be little to nothing done to ensure precision and limit unintended harm, thus making the risk of use of explosive weapons with wide area effects to civilian lives and well-being far from mitigatable in populated area conflicts. NPA also wishes to align ourselves with the statement made by INU, of which we are a member. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Uruguay, to be followed by Plowshares. Uruguay, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, Ambassador. Uruguay, first of all, would like, as other delegations have done, to thank Ireland for the major effort made to ensure that this political declaration should be prepared. I'd also like to give the thanks of my delegation to all those who have contributed over the years to make this process into a reality, and all delegations who, with their dedication and hard work, have brought us to this point. Uruguay, at the same time, would like to express its willingness to work with the last draft that we have, despite the fact that it doesn't fully reflect the humanitarian and other concerns of my country, because we want to achieve the sending of a clear and firm message on the effects of explosive weapons in urban areas and to bring an end to the suffering and destruction that it causes to civilians, in particular the effects on infrastructure such as schools and hospitals with long-term effects. We encourage all parties to work towards signing this declaration so that we can ensure it becomes a reality and brings an end to explosive weapons in populated areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Plowshares, to be followed by Palestine.
Thank you, Chair. I am speaking on behalf of Project Plowshares and of the CELAC Network on Human Security in Latin America, both members of the International Network on Explosive Weapons. We want to express our sincere gratitude to Ireland, and in particular to you, Ambassador Gaffey, as well as your team, for your capable leadership of this process. We have commented on the text and specific provisions of the political declaration in the context of earlier consultations, and do not intend to restate all those positions here today. But we do want to emphasize our view that the need to comply with international humanitarian law is self-evident and should be seen as a minimum baseline for the implementation of the political declaration and not its sole objective. Widespread and systematic civilian suffering continues to be observed in armed conflicts around the world, despite assurances by many states that adequate mechanisms to protect civilians are already in place. More than 70 years after the Geneva Conventions, civilians continue to bear the brunt of armed conflict. We greatly appreciate Ireland's work to balance the wide range of views that have been expressed on the various drafts of the political declaration. At the same time, we very much hope that your good faith efforts to respond to the concerns of various states will result in the broad endorsement of this declaration. In our view, the version before us today constitutes a positive contribution to the multilateral normative regime concerning the protection of civilians in armed conflict. The political declaration creates a legitimate expectation of change, and its effective implementation must have a concrete and meaningful impact on the protection of civilians. Going forward, there must be clear, measurable improvements in the pattern of harm to civilians that has been so well documented throughout this process, including related to the staggering proportion of civilian casualties when explosive weapons are used in populated areas, which consistently stands at around 90% over time and across conflict zones. This reality must change, and the extent to which it does will be the ultimate measure of the political declaration's effectiveness. Whatever the specific wording in each section of the political declaration, there should be no doubt about the spirit and the intent of this process: to strengthen the protection of civilians by moving away from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Palestine, to be followed by the Friends World Committee for Consultation. Palestine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Please allow me to start by expressing the State of Palestine's gratitude for Ireland's stellar leadership of the process that has led to the final draft of this important political declaration. We would like to commend you for the inclusive and transparent manner in which you have conducted all rounds of negotiation and your continued dedication to the process, including during the difficult circumstances posed by the pandemic. Mr. Chair, as a nation that has suffered severely from the repeated use of EWIPA, particularly in Gaza, which is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, we are acutely aware of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences engendered by the use of these weapons. As has been already stated several times today, evidence shows that when explosive weapons are used in populated areas, approximately 90% of those killed and injured are civilians. Many survivors are left with lifelong disabilities and psychological trauma. But the humanitarian impacts of EWIPA are not limited to death and injury. Beyond civilians killed and injured, an even greater number of civilians well beyond the weapons blast zones are affected due to reverberating effects. The destruction of essential civilian infrastructure sets off domino effects that manifest across a wide range of interconnected sectors, including healthcare, education, food security, water and sanitation, electricity, shelter, and the environment. This has devastating consequences for people's lives, societal and national development, and stability that are felt long after the blast occurs. Our participation in the process has been driven by our firm conviction that urgent and concrete measures should be taken to put an end to this unacceptable pattern of harm. We have engaged in negotiations with a view to reaching an ambitious and forward-looking political declaration with commitments that will bring about real change for civilians. In this regard, the State of Palestine is pleased to see significant improvements in the final draft circulated by Ireland. Inter alia, we welcome the fact that the declaration's text now clearly recognizes the link between the use of EWIPA and grave humanitarian consequences, including both direct and reverberating effects. We welcome also references to accountability, facilitating humanitarian access, victim assistance, and the role of data collection and analysis to better understand humanitarian impacts. Having said that, it should come as no surprise that there are some aspects of the text that we would have liked to be drafted differently. Indeed, we remain convinced that ending, or at the very least avoiding, the use of EWIPA is the most effective way to protect civilians. On paragraph 3.3, which contains the core commitment of the text, we would have thus preferred an explicit and unequivocal commitment for states to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. However, we do understand that the current language strikes a delicate balance between different views and interests, and we see it as a positive step forward towards an avoidance policy. Indeed, we understand the term refrain from the use of EWIPA to mean refrain from use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. And we understand the term restrict as meaning restrict the use of all other EWIPA. We are thus hopeful that adoption of this language will lead states to adopt policies in presumption against the use of EWIPA. Mr. Chair, overall, we believe that you have provided us with a solid and meaningful political declaration with concrete measures and commitments that holds the potential to be an effective tool for strengthening the protection of civilians from the use of EWIPA. Like many other speakers before me, and as outlined in paragraph 4.7, we view this political declaration not as an end in itself, but rather as a starting point for future work to be carried out in a collaborative and inclusive spirit. Finally, we believe that this declaration will have the most tangible impact on the ground if it is adopted by as many states as possible. While we would have hoped for a stronger text, we acknowledge that the adoption of this declaration would constitute an important step forward, and in the spirit of multilateralism, flexibility, and good faith, I am pleased to confirm that the State of Palestine is ready to endorse this declaration as it currently reads.
We hope that other states, particularly states with relevant military operational experience, will demonstrate a similar degree of flexibility. We once again congratulate you, Ambassador Gaffey, and your team for your tremendous work and look forward to seeing you in Dublin. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to the Friends World Committee for Consultation, followed by Argentina. You have the floor.
Along with states and civil society in the room today, FWCC CUNO wants to thank Ireland for the inclusion and transparency in this process and for its leadership and efforts in developing this declaration. This declaration has the potential to enact meaningful change away from the harmful use of explosive weapons. It lays forth clearly the devastating harm caused by explosive weapons on civilians and civilian objects, of the deaths, the destruction, and the traumas that continue to mar the lives of those affected. In doing so, this declaration also clearly demonstrates that states themselves hold the power to prevent and avoid civilian harm by foregoing the use of explosive weapons. We see the value of this declaration as an important contribution to efforts to end the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and to strengthen the protection of civilians, but also part of the path towards ending their use full stop. However, we align with the points made by Wilf today, including on paragraph 3.3. We believe the commitments laid forth in this declaration could have gone further. We regret the addition of the qualifier as appropriate, which risks undermining the implementation of this declaration. We therefore urge states to implement this declaration to its fullest, remembering its goal as an effective instrument to strengthen the protection of civilians, to save lives, and to promote a presumption against the use of explosive weapons. Throughout this process, states and civil society have called for clear and strong commitments that will reduce and prevent harm to civilians. As many delegations have shared throughout the years, we must foster behavioural change against the use of explosive weapons. We look forward to supporting this behaviour change, and it is in this light that we will work with states, civil society, and other relevant stakeholders to interpret and implement this declaration against the use of explosive weapons. These efforts fit squarely into our continued efforts to draw attention to and change practice of the harmful use of all weapons and their negative impact on civilians and their human rights. And to that effect, we also call on all stakeholders concerned to fulfil their responsibilities and obligations to international law. As we move into the implementation of this text, let us remember the aim of the declaration: to prevent and reduce harm to civilians from the use of explosive weapons, to foster behavioural change, and to go beyond reaffirming the law. Ending the use of explosive weapons is the single best way to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Argentina, to be followed by Human Rights Watch. Argentina, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, we would like to thank you and your team for the consultations for today and the review of the political declaration, which we are in a position to adopt, to support. When it comes to the Declaration on Safe Schools from 2014, which was supported by 114 states, we are pleased to see that in paragraph 1.4 of the Declaration, we continue to recognize that the use of explosive weapons in populated areas provoke and cause disruption to basic needs and services. We saw in previous consultation meetings, we welcomed already paragraph 1.5 and the recognition there to the additional suffering caused by WIPA to the civilian population and the destruction of homes and schools. So we would like to welcome the addition in this paragraph of the reference to hospitals and places of worship. We are pleased to see the declaration recognizes the direct and indirect effects of the use of these weapons, while we would have preferred to have seen reverberating effects rather than indirect effects in paragraphs 3.4 and 4.2. We'd also like to highlight our support to paragraph 1.2.1, where there's reaffirmation of the link between these explosive weapons and the need to fully respect human rights. We would like this paragraph to be linked to human rights and WIPA in a more direct manner, and we regret that some amendments on the humanitarian long-term effects, which are inherent with the use of WIPAs, and other amendments which were introduced to the text, we would like that those mean that this version is less ambitious than the previous, but we understand the very delicate balance that you have had to walk to ensure that you present a declaration that will allow us to adopt it. And I'd like to repeat that we are in a position to support it. And I'd like to thank Ireland for their transparent manner of carrying out this work. And we would like to state our interest in continuing to work with you to have more states join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will give the floor now to Human Rights Watch, to be followed by Minds Action Canada. Human Rights Watch, you have the floor.
Thank you. First of all, let us express our gratitude to Ireland for the transparent, inclusive, and effective process that you have organized over the course of the challenging past few years. The adoption of this declaration is a significant milestone in the protection of civilians. As noted in the chapeau to the operative section, the declaration has three goals: improving the protection of civilians, addressing the humanitarian consequences, and strengthening compliance with international humanitarian law. It thus goes beyond simply restating existing international law and commits states to take additional steps that will advance humanitarian ends. The text achieves these goals in several ways. It recognizes the pattern of direct and indirect or reverberating effects caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. It commits states to collect data, assist victims, and hold follow-up meetings. It also includes commitments to adopt policies and practices that enhance civilian protection. The finalization of this text is only the first step, however. Now states must turn to universalizing, interpreting, and implementing the declaration. We are pleased to hear so many states say they will sign the declaration and encourage more to do so. We urge states to interpret the language strongly. For example, while paragraph 3.3 is not worded as clearly as we would like, it can be interpreted to better protect civilians. States should refrain, that is, avoid the use in populated areas of explosive weapons with wide area effects, which the preamble shows increases the risk of civilian harm. States should restrict the use of explosive weapons in populated areas in all other cases. Finally, states should implement the declaration effectively, ensuring they turn the provisions on policies and practices, data collection, victim assistance, humanitarian access, and more into action. Thank you.
Is it? Oh, there at last. Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to Minds Action Canada. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Minds Action Canada would like to thank the Government of Ireland and you, Ambassador, for your able steering of this process through what became surprisingly choppy waters. We welcome the final text, and as a founding member of INU, we support the comments made by our colleagues all day. But we'd like to take this opportunity to add a few comments in our organizational capacity. We, of course, would have liked to see a strong commitment by states to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. But we believe that this political declaration will be a stable foundation for ongoing work to protect civilians from the harm caused by explosive weapons use. Minds Action Canada appreciates the recognition of the impact of unexploded ordnance on civilians in paragraph 1.6 and the commitment to undertake marking, clearance, and removal or destruction of explosive remnants of war and explosive ordnance risk education in paragraph 3.5. We welcome the commitments towards victim assistance, as victim assistance is crucially important since the impact of a WIPA lasts long after the bombs fall silent. The references to gender in paragraph 1.10 and 4.5 are also very important, as effective policy and practice must recognize the different impacts of a WIPA on people of different genders, ages, and other diversity factors. Minds Action Canada believes that it is always appropriate and feasible to make publicly available disaggregated data on the direct and indirect effects on civilians and civilian objects of military operations involving the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We are pleased that this text recognizes the crucial role that civil society has played in the development of the Declaration and will continue to play in its universalization and implementation. We join INU in pledging to support the ongoing work on this declaration. Although Canada has not seen the bombing and shelling of our cities and towns, the reverberating effects of AWIPA have shaped countless Canadians. In my family, my 97-year-old aunt still speaks of how horrid it was to be sent away from her family and her home in Edinburgh when she was a child during the Blitz. But she's not alone. Minds Action Canada recognizes that many Canadians are Canadians strictly because they or their family members sought safety from bombing and shelling, whether it was Vietnam in the 1970s, Lebanon in the 1980s, the Balkans in the 1990s, Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, Syria in the 2010s, or the Ukrainians who are arriving daily as we speak. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas has impacted hundreds of thousands of people who now call Canada home. For more than a decade, we have seen a deadly pattern of harm that requires changes in policy and practice to protect civilians and civilian objects. There needs to be stronger restrictions on the use of these weapons. The commitment in this declaration are a good starting point for the international community's shared goal of reducing civilian harm. To echo the words of you, Ambassador Gaffey, and many others today, we hope that the conclusion of these negotiations is just the beginning rather than the end of the important process. Thus far, the process has shown that the problem of explosive weapons use in populated areas is a global one that needs a global solution. So today we call on not just our own country, Canada, but all states to endorse and implement the declaration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Now we have one more speaker on the list, China. If anyone else wishes to speak, please just raise your nameplate now. And I give the floor now to China. You have the floor.
谢谢高飞大使。
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
首先，
First of all, speaking on behalf of China,
高飞大使及您的团队。
I'd like to join with all the previous speakers in thanking you, Ambassador, and your team for your efforts.
中方高度重视在人口密集区使用爆炸装置。
China attaches great importance to the use of these types of weapons in populated areas. The whole problem of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, this is of great importance, and China has been working since the beginning on this process. And China notes that there are already improvements in the text before us. Some types of improvements in the text. And China would like to thank our Irish colleagues who agreed to the Chinese proposals. At the same time, China would like to thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your clarifications. We are not intending to add any new obligations or any legal obligations or new legal interpretations. And on the basis of this principle, we believe that all of the measures referred to in the declaration should go beyond the framework of voluntarism. And we also share the view of other colleagues that we need to resolve the problem.
关于3.3段，中方有一个技术性的修改。
As to para 3.3, we've had some technical proposals to make.
在宣言的1.7、1.8和2.2段中，在提及 civilian harm 时
1.7 and 1.8, when we talk about exceeding harms,
前面都会有加一句 and 的音
we need to add and any event. So China, therefore, is proposing to add the same in para 3.3 to be consistent throughout. And China does hope that Ambassador Gaffey will be able to continue working to finalize the process. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much for that. Now, that was the last intervention on our list. I don't see any more nameplates, so I think I can take it that I can thank you all for what has been a really, really good exchange of views. At every stage in this process, the consultations and discussions that we've had have actually exceeded our expectations. And I must say that has been the same. We said so in April, but that has definitely been the same today. And I am really, really grateful to you all. This has been, over the last 3 years, a remarkable collective effort. And I stress that it has been a remarkable collective effort by states, by international organizations, and by civil society. And I think today, at the end of our session, we can say that we now have the final text of a political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And I want to thank those delegations that have indicated already that they are in a position to sign the text. A lot of delegations have said so today, and we really welcome that commitment and your leadership, which I hope will inspire others to do the same. I realize that there are different procedures for different states, and they must be gone through, but I just would like to urge those of you who are pushing for confirmation in your system to continue to do so, so that your state is in a position to come on board as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your work and for your efforts. Now, I know that many of you are also, all of you are wondering what the next steps will be in terms of the adoption or the signing ceremony for this political declaration. I know that we are supposedly looking at all the castles of Ireland to find the best and most appropriate one for it, but I can confirm for sure that Ireland will host a high-level signing ceremony for the formal adoption of the political declaration in Dublin. The precise venue we are still finalising, and the date. So please bear with us a little while we work on those details. But I can tell you for certain that there will be a signing ceremony and a high-level conference in Dublin this autumn. Absolutely committed to that, and we will look forward to seeing you at that, and we are determined to maintain the momentum that has been so evident in April and again here in the room today. So we will remain in close contact with you in the coming weeks on those details, and we will make sure that you have the details in time to encourage your senior representatives and ministers to attend the conference. I also want to say a few words on translation of the declaration, because multilingualism has been a key feature throughout the process, and we firmly believe that multilingualism reinforces multilateralism. So now that the declaration has been finalized, we'll begin the process of translating it into all official languages of the United Nations. When that's completed, we will upload it on our website and make it available to all delegations. We hope this will also assist in finalizing the approval process. And again, we will stay in close contact with you on these details. You will be hearing from us over the coming weeks on that. So really, I honestly believe that this has been a significant day at a very difficult time for all of us and a very difficult time for the world. And it is significant that we now have a political declaration which recognizes the problem to be addressed, which situates it in international law and obligations on states and militaries, and which sets out actions that states and militaries can and will take, which will help protect civilians in conflict, and especially facing the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. So all I can do is thank all delegations, thank the states, the international organizations, and civil society for the spirit with which you have approached this process and your dedication to it. I thank you all most sincerely, but I also want to thank my colleagues in Dublin, and I think you'll understand if I very specially single out one person, my colleague Jamie Walsh, who I really, really want to thank, and you know that. Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you for that recognition of Jamie's efforts, because he hasn't left any of you alone for a single day in the past months. I know that very well. Look, all I can say is these are very difficult days for the world. They are very difficult days for multilateralism. And I really thank you for recognizing that challenging times require creative and ambitious responses. And I think with this declaration, we have sent a strong signal that multilateralism can work. And we have also sent a strong signal that we are ready to adopt a declaration which will be relevant to current conflicts and to future conflicts, because it sends out an unambiguous message on the fundamental importance of the protection of civilians in armed conflict. And never has that message been more necessary, and never has it been more necessary that we act on our commitments and implement them as soon as possible. I think all of us in this room are doing the jobs we're doing because we have a commitment to a thing called multilateralism, effective multilateralism. It regularly, and especially in these days, comes into question. We regularly hear questioning of the need for consensus hindering the ability to reach agreement on anything meaningful. So I think all of us in our work would hope always to achieve meaningful steps forward that improve people's lives and help change the world that we live in for the better. It can be frustrating, but I think what we've shown is that if we do work together with collective intent and commitment, that we can achieve something from multilateralism, that we can provide some hope in dark days. So, as I've said before, and as so many people have said here, this might not feel it, but it's actually the beginning of a process, not the end of a process. We dedicate our work to civilians who are in danger even as we speak. And I just close by saying we look forward to seeing you in Dublin in a few months' time. Thank you very much. Thank you for all your work. Thank you. Sorry, just want to do this. I want to close the meeting.